breathing and trauma, psychotherapy, addiction, and the relationship with mental health. I have Tom Herron. I know Tom longer than any of the instructors that are affiliated with us. I think we first met back, Tom, probably 2004, 2005. You've got an amazing story. You're based in the north of Ireland. You've had a tremendous change of careers. And I think you've got a story that many, many people will resonate. And also the fact that you lived in the north of Ireland, that you are probably in a hot spot for trauma. So, Tom, I think we're going to have a great chat over the next hour. And you know what? I'd love to give some information out there that the listener can pick something out of it. And especially because mental health and psychotherapy, breathing is never really looked at. And if it is, it's only kind of the toe is dipped into the water. And sleep is not looked at. And how can you have stillness of the mind and calmness of the mind unless you have good breathing and good sleep? But Tom, just a little bit of background. Welcome, and just to introduce yourself, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. My name's Tom Herron, and I work now as a hypnotherapist, psychotherapist, lifestyle coach, and breathing coach, thanks to Patrick. And it's amazing how people get into the careers that they finish up in. And I believe that my career now was, well, it was established some time ago by the experience, my life experiences as I was growing up as a child. And I trained as a trauma counselor because I didn't know actually what was wrong with me. And I was trying to work out what was wrong with me, and it sort of brought me on the path of this job that I'm in now. And it's fascinating. So I suppose one of the things that I remember was being bullied at school. And I was bullied in a local school, and I was a little place called Coal Island. And I lived there. My father had died when I was 9. And I remember being angry at my father for dying. Like, I mean, what sort of a father dies on you? So then I felt really guilty about that because, you know, imagine saying or thinking something like that about someone that had died. So I was traumatized at that age, but didn't actually know it. So then I happened to pass the 11 plus, which was a really big thing. And the 11 plus was the exam in Northern Ireland that got you from grammar or from primary school to grammar school. And I was so excited that I passed this. I haven't a clue how I did it, but I did it. And then I was going to go to school in, I was going to go to secondary school or grammar school. And I went from primary school in Coal Island to a primary school in Dungannon, which was about 4 miles away. And the Coal Island guys and Dungannon guys never got really on, you see. And so therefore, I was this Coal Island fella in the Dungannon school. So plenty of bullying again, you know. So it was interesting in the sense that I was with the Presbyterian brothers, Presentation Brothers, sorry. The Presentation Brothers. And this brother says to my mother, if you don't get this guy into boarding school, he's so easily led that he could actually join one of the paramilitaries. And I was 11 years old. So I was sent then to school in South Armagh. I was sent to live in South Armagh and go to school in Newry, because Newry was a day school. I couldn't get into Armagh, which was a boarding school, because it was full up. And I went on and stayed with an aunt who was something like a far out relation, a second cousin of my grandfather's. And I stayed there for 7 years. And so from 11 to 18, I was away from home. So now I know the separation trauma there as well, you know. So, and I remember being at school, and school those days was tough. It was tough, and some of the experiences I had were brutal. You know, I remember a maths teacher really lunging into me one time and giving me a hard time, and I actually died that night.
He died that night.
He died that night.
Wow, God Almighty! Wow.
Oh God rest him, but he died that night. But it was amazing how all the the emotions that I had regarding that.
Yeah.
So then after school, my family was involved in the bookmaking business. And when my father had died, if I ever got home, which I got home about once a month when I was at school, my uncle used to bring me into the bookies, and he would treat me really well. And he gave me money for helping him on a Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Now I remember doing that from I was 9 years old. And then, so the gambling and bookmaking thing was second nature to me.
Mm.
And he would give me money every Saturday that I went home. And I went back to school with this money. And I was the richest guy in the school, because nobody had any money. Yeah. And it was amazing. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I left. That uncle took ill. So when I left school at 18, I went into the bookies, and I started to work there, which I really liked the buzz, because it was an adrenaline rush all the time. I then got an on-course bookmaking license. I made a book at Greyhounds. I made a book at the races all around Ireland.
So you were doing well at the bookies. You were doing well in terms of.
Yes, it really gave me a good lifestyle. You know, it gave me a really, really nice lifestyle, which was hard to give up, because I couldn't see anything else that was going to pay me better.
Yeah,
and then got myself a pub. So I had a bookies in a pub, and then we had the bookies. The first bookies went into 2, and then to 3, and then to 4, and then I had an amusement arcade in Belfast, which was another extension of the gambling business, if you like. So I was well steeped in that sort of culture, and but there was something wrong. My lifestyle was hectic, and I was drinking far too much, and I was drinking to the extent that actually it became a serious problem, because like my first question mark about my drinking habits was in 1976, when I was hospitalized for alcohol. I was 20 years old.
20.
And yeah, and I was after having a serious car accident, and that was traumatic in itself. So after that, then I started to. I would have been a binge drinker, so I wouldn't have drank all the time. But when I did, you knew about it, and so I curtailed it as best I could. But I was functioning, and I still was working, and I still was doing this, that, the other thing. And anyway, there was always something that just didn't sit well with me. And I got married, and we had children, and thankfully everything was going pretty well. And then there was an incident happened where a bookmaker friend of mine I lived in Northern Ireland, and you always have got, Northern Ireland was full of trauma, as you know. There was a semi-war zone. Yeah. And my friend, who I would have driven one day to the races and he would have driven the next. That was the sort of relationship we had, you know, when I started to make a book at Southern Ireland races. And this day he was on his own in 1990, and he was actually shot dead in Prosper in County Kildare.
I remember it.
Yeah.
It was his Fox, wasn't it, his surname?
Fox, yeah.
Yeah.
And that totally changed things for me. And I decided, look, there's nothing worth that.
Yeah.
So I started to look at ways of getting out of the bookmaking business. And then I sold up about 1993. But I hadn't a clue what I was going to do. And so I didn't actually know what to do. But I knew there was something. Anybody I spoke to said, you know, I was thinking of selling, and they said, well, what's wrong with you? What more do you want? Mm-hmm. You know, and someone actually said to me, what's wrong with your head? And I says, you know, we might be right. There might be something wrong with my head. He says, what more do you want? You know, you've got a nice house, you've got a nice lifestyle, what more do you want? Mm-hmm. And I was wrestling with myself, wondering what was wrong with me. So I decided to look at, all I had was A-level education at the time. And so basically I couldn't actually walk into anything else. I had to do something more. So I went looking around things, and I saw this course on hypnosis. And I says, there's something that's drawn me towards that. So I did. And that was one of the things that made all the sense in the world to me. But in between times, I had this notion that I wanted to rear ostriches. So I bought these ostriches, and I rented this farm, and I started to rear ostriches, knowing nothing about ostriches. And I was fascinated with these ostriches because this ostrich could freak out and do lots of damage for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then walk about as if nothing happened. And that reminded me of an old Bruce Lee film, where Bruce Lee, he had a hood up and he wouldn't give tuppence for him. And then somebody would annoy him and he would freak out and he'd beat them all up. And then he'd put the hood up and as if nothing happened.
Yeah. So he was able to go from, he wasn't carrying baggage, or the ostrich wasn't, something that happened once, but they're not carrying it with them forevermore. That's not typically what human beings do, Tom.
Not at all. And I couldn't understand how anybody could do it. And the ostrich reminded me of him. And I says, I want to be able to do that. And when I started the hypnosis, it was the first thing that made sense to me, because you could do it in that state. You could actually get into that state. And so that made sense to me. So I started to look into that. And then I went and I trained with Paul McKenna, and I trained with Richard Bandler, who was the NLP guys at the time, and a guy called Michael Breen. So it was McKenna, Breen, and Bandler. And again, fascinated me because it was the use of language, and it was the use of changing states. And NLP was really useful. So then after that, I decided that I was going to get myself more credible. So I wanted to do a psychology degree, which I did. And it fascinated me as well, because it was teaching me how to measure, how to measure things, because then I could know if something was working by measuring. So that was really useful. And then client came to me and said to me at the time, he says, have you heard of the Buteyko method? And I says, no. And he handed me this little cassette. It was cassettes at that time. And he said, have a look at that, or have a listen to that. So I listened to it, and it was about the Teresa Hale Clinic. And it made reference to a book, Breathing Free, that she had available at the time. And I says, wow, I need this. So I need to learn this. It made all the sense to me. But Patrick, some people can learn by video. Some people can learn by reading. I need coached.
Sure, you need face-to-face interaction.
I need coached, and I need the interaction, and I need something that I can ask a question about something immediately. So I was looking then for the coach, and I found out that there was a coach called Alexander Stalmatsky in the Teresa Hale Clinic, which I went to explore, but he had left. So I was left then. I thought that was the end of my Buteyko career, and then a really good friend of mine saw an article in the Irish Independent, which I don't even think exists anymore.
It does, yeah, but I suppose mainstream media is probably not as popular now as it was. That was 15 years ago, Tom.
That's 15 years ago. Well, so she gave me this, and she says, so I immediately contacted yourself, and we met in Sligo, and you trained me up as a tutor for the Buteyko method, and then Oxygen Advantage after that. Yeah. And it's fascinating in the sense that the breathing made all the sense in the world to me. It made everything. So I started to apply it to all aspects of what you were doing. Practice. Every aspect. The first thing anybody that was with me was I taught them to reduce breathing, and I taught them to tape their mouth at night and stuff like that. Yeah. So
Tom, in comparison, so say for instance, like I think you were really well positioned in terms of you experienced life events, so you can identify with the person coming into you. You
Yes.
were in it was a pretty hostile environment for a
Yes.
number of decades, the north of Ireland. So you can resonate with that. You became a psychotherapist. You knew
Mm-hmm.
about neuro-linguistic programming. You brought in breathing. You brought in sleep.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a client coming in your door, what would be the typical kind of approach that you would take? I'm just curious as to get inside your mind that if somebody is dealing with trauma, and
Yes.
let's face it, probably it's going to be a large proportion of the population, what would you say would be a good approach? Just kind of along those lines.
One of the things that it's one of the reasons why I developed the PEPSfit program, which is
Mhm.
physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. So if you take them in that order, so
Physical.
the first thing I do is the physical. So the physical thing is so massive because when you talk about emotional stuff to people, when you talk about emotional stuff, it can go over their head. When you talk about psychological techniques, it can go over their head. And definitely if you go into the spiritual aspect, it's definitely they're going to, not for me,
Yes. Yeah.
So the physical to me is so important. And the physiology will obviously have an effect on the emotionality, which will have an effect on the psychology, which will have an effect on the spirituality.
So what you mean, Tom, by physical is, do you mean by doing physical exercise, or do you mean by addressing the physiology? And just before you answer, men don't tend to be the greatest at seeking help. And yet they are the group of individuals who are not the best at coping with issues.
Yes.
So a little bit about that in terms of physical.
So the physical, in the sense, is someone comes into me typically for I had a guy came in and his brother was only after taking his life, and this guy, for example, had fallen out with the brother
Oh,
beforehand.
God.
So he was in a horrendous state, and I hadn't seen him. And he rang me up and he says, "I need to see somebody." And I says, "Well, you're welcome to come down here, but the weather's horrendous. There was a lot of snow." And I says, "I haven't been out, so I can't tell you what the main roads are like." And he says, "I'm coming anyway." And I live at the top of a big hill, and there's no chance of him getting up my hill in the snow unless you have a Jeep. So he says, "I'm coming anyway." So basically what I did with him, I looked at him and I saw the state he was in, and he was physically shaking. So I says to him, "Look, trust me." And so I got him to take his socks and shoes off, and him and I walked on the lawn in the snow.
Yes.
And so then the next thing I started to get him to do small breath holds and hum.
Yeah.
So the humming then took his mind off the snow. And
Yeah.
so the next thing I started, and we did this for about 20 minutes.
So coming back to the snow was a means of you getting him out of his head,
Get him out of his
because
head.
he had no other kind of choice but to bring his attention because his feet were freezing.
They were freezing. So
Yeah.
he was getting out of his head. And I remember working with a serial reoffender, and the serial reoffender wouldn't look at me, and he was sent by the judge to me.
And
It was
do you
either
mind
seeing
asking
me,
if I ask what crime, or is that okay?
what crime? Well, this guy hadn't been in trouble until he was about 18 years old. And when I met him, he was about 32, and he'd been 26 times in jail.
Wow.
So jail wasn't working for him. So basically, as an intervention, I went and asked the judge, would he give us a shot at rehabilitating him? Because obviously what was happening wasn't working. And the longest time he was out was 3 weeks. So he'd be 3 weeks out and then be back in again. He'd be 3 weeks out and back in again. So we decided that we would work. And I remember him looking at the ground, and he couldn't look at me. So it's there was serious trauma going on. And I knew that there was no point in asking him about anything. He had to feel safe. So I had to create a safe environment for him. So now creating a safe environment and not being his friend is a tricky sort of balance, because if you're a friend, he'll ask you to do something. You know what I'm saying? So I had to create a safe place, which I did. So I says to him, look, I'm just going to ask some questions here. And I says, what did you do at the weekend? He says, I was out of my head. And I says, so you were out of your head? And how were you out of your head? It was drugs and drink. And he kept looking at the floor. And I says, well, how would you like to get out of your head now? First time he had eye contact with me. And he says, aye, yes. And I says, okay, we're going to get out of your head. So the next thing, I got headphones and I put him on a massage chair. And I put the headphones on, turned on the massage chair, and all I could hear him was, ah, ee, ah, ooh, ee, ee, ee. And I says, now you're out of your head. You're in your body. You know? And he kept coming, and he kept coming just to get that. And I says, wow, now this is something, there's a connection here, you know. And the interesting thing is, to cut a long story short, that's about 8 years ago, and he hasn't been in jail since. So,
but Tom, this is fascinating stuff, because it's obviously that locking a guy up like this continuously, it's not working. And it's a total waste of time. It's a waste of resources, socially, economically, and morally. It's not the right thing to do. So why do you think he was why was he serial reoffending continuously? Why do you think that? And would you say that all of issues, whether it's addiction, whether it's criminality, whether it's domestic violence, do you think that it's partly or going to be related to trauma that people have experienced during childhood? And what would be a better routine or route there?
Absolutely. You'll find that if we go back, like traditional psychotherapists go back and trail through what happened in childhood. I take a different route. I start from now, because there's nothing I can do about the past. So basically, I start from now. So therefore, I have introduced ways that people don't have to disclose. Remember, I was working with security forces, paramilitaries, people that weren't safe to tell you their story. And just to describe,
because we will have some international paramilitaries are, you're talking about, these are illegal armies such as the UVF, is it? The IRA?
Yeah. The UVF, the IRA, the INLA, there was different sections of illegal armed militia.
Yes.
And they still needed help. Now, I wasn't interested in what somebody did or didn't do, because the least I know, the less I can say. You know?
Yes.
So but somebody needs help, they need help. And like lots of people were driven into things and doing things that was totally against their values.
Yeah.
Like I now know that my job was me wrestling with two sets of values, because I was wrestling with having a nice lifestyle in the bookmaking business, and someone had to lose in order for me to make a living.
Yeah.
So, and I says, like, this can't, they're irreconcilable.
It doesn't marry. Yeah.
So basically, and I could, once I come to terms with that, alcohol never was an issue after it.
And I would say as well that the people going in and gambling obsessively, that is going to be related, because I have heard more stories, and really now worse than ever in terms of online, that you can gamble 24/7 and there's no limit to what you could do with it. But coming back to the individual, so the serial reoffender, Tom, in terms of, without of course disclosing, but I'm just interested, what would you think were the building blocks to cause him to do what he did? Or is it just a self-fulfilling prophecy? Once he dips his toe in, that you're kind of brought in a little bit more and more and more?
Well, when we look at trauma is essentially, the way that I look at trauma, and I was taught this by, it was actually, my tutor taught trauma throughout the Troubles. And I worked with groups of traumatic people through him. right through the Troubles, and it was fascinating work. So, and his take on it was that trauma is when the world as you know it is changed without your consent. So when I was 9, my father died, so my world had changed without my consent, as it were. So basically there was serious trauma. So say, for example, someone is dealing with the culture of paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, where you have, to survive, sometimes you have to take sides. And you may not want to take sides, but you're scared to do anything else. So basically the world as you know it has changed without your consent. And then something happens that some family member could have been killed in the process. So therefore that hardens opinions and hardens your feelings around the whole scenario. And it changes people's thinking. So once we have those notions, the world has changed without our consent. So basically, that's where we are traumatized. Now, the antidote to trauma is soothing. And the issue isn't always the trauma, because the trauma isn't actually the issue. It's the absence of soothing is usually the issue. And if you take it, for example, when I was finished school, like going to school, and maybe about 16, I was introduced to beer. Well, beer was the greatest thing ever, because if I took half a dozen bottles of beer, I could talk to girls, I could do anything. I had found my perfect soother.
Yeah, yeah.
So I started to take the soother. So then from there, anytime there was a crisis, I started to soothe with the alcohol.
Yeah.
And then you realize that alcohol won't soothe you.
I know before you made a comparison of a child playing in a schoolyard.
Yes.
And if the child trips.
So if the child trips, for example, when we think of trauma, think of children. Because trauma makes us childlike. So you take what goes on in a playground, and the child goes and he trips and he cuts his knee. His world has changed without his consent, totally changed. So he's all over the place.
Yeah.
And he runs to where he feels safe.
Yeah.
So it could be the mother, it could be the teacher, whoever's safe. So he's looking safety. And the teacher gets him, or the mother gets him, cuddles him, comforts him.
Yeah.
And he forgets about it.
Yeah.
But what happens the guy that hasn't got the mother, hasn't got the teacher, hasn't got someone to go to? He has to find his own way to soothe.
Yeah.
So his whole world has changed and he doesn't know what to do. So he has to get his own way to soothe. And he may hit another guy to get him to cry so that he has joined him.
Yeah.
And then that's that could be the essence of a bullying career.
Yeah.
And
I've seen it. Tom, I've seen it in my own hometown. And I've seen individuals there. And I was only thinking, because I knew we were having this chat today. I remember being in primary school. We were only 8 or 9 years of age. And you had other 8 or 9-year-olds, 1 or 2 in particular. And they would literally grab you by the throat and squeeze. Yeah. And this is not innate in an 8 or 9-year-old. Like, kids aren't born with this frame of mind. They are taught it, they are conditioned, and they are programmed. And it's horrific, because you have normal kids, good kids going, and you've got a couple of kids who are traumatized and making not only their own life a living hell, but the life around them a living hell. They don't just pollute their own space. They pollute the space of everybody and everything around them.
Absolutely.
And you think that's coming back to the trauma that they have experienced? They have
a trauma, absolutely, and then it gives them the sense of the power. So that then they've got conflicting values again. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, and it's fascinating. So just think, for example, Patrick, that, when we talk about childlike behavior and adult behavior. So if I said to you, is huffing adult behavior?
Huffing.
You'd probably saying, no, it's not out, but adults that do it.
Oh, go into a huff. Yes. Oh, totally. I think it's very normal for many people. Yes.
But you see, it's normal because trauma makes them childlike. It reminds them of some trauma, right? So is name calling adult behavior? It's something you would see, but know adults that do it because trauma makes them childlike. And if I said to you bullying, adults that may bully, but that's what happens in the playground as well. So again, it's showing that adults can become childlike.
So it's really they're dealing with their own insecurities, that they don't feel comfortable with their own lives, that the only sense of worth that they have is by bullying and inflicting pain on other people. So Tom, could I say that having a sense of purpose is really, really important in one's life in terms of the value of what you contribute to society? And this is coming back to the introduction. You were in the bookmaking business, and I like that. For you to make money, people had to place a bet, but not to win. They had to lose.
They had to lose. Yeah.
And, it's in actual fact, when you break it down, bookmaking, for me now, I'm going to use the word, it's a very sinister business because it's mostly probably individuals who are very vulnerable who are in there in the first instance.
There's absolutely no doubt.
And so the sense of purpose then, are we all kind of chasing this buzz or, that sense of fulfillment? So you were talking about then soothing is that the alcohol could be soothing for one individual. Yes. The placing the bet on the horse if it wins is soothing for another individual. Bullying is soothing for another individual. Yeah. But is there some way that in life, if we were directed to, and I often use occupation because I think for myself, and you change your career, I changed my career. And we went into an occupation that suited us, that we love it, that we can help people. It's very rewarding. And it gives us a sense of purpose that it kind of distills any other feelings or any other that you don't feel that need that other people might need to escape.
Well, if you look, the greatest gift that we have, Patrick, is that we have the opportunity to help people. Mm-hmm. And that is the greatest thing ever, because that's the greatest sense of satisfaction for me. That beats winning the derby for me, because, and at one time I wouldn't have thought like that at all, simply because, the values were
different.
Changed. Definitely different, or else there were conflicting values, but the other side won, so we make excuses for things. So I believe that life is like a journey of self-discovery. And I find that, what doesn't suit me, there's a good chance it won't suit somebody else. And we must realize the damage that shaming someone can do. And I just have, I'm getting together a little momentum where what I would like would be that in the courts or around the courts pages and newspapers will be taken away, because basically it's only public shaming, and shaming is a horrendous feeling. Now we all know what it feels like, but sometimes we mix up the feelings of guilt and shame. And to me, guilt is like feeling bad about something you did or failed to do, but shaming is feeling bad about who you are. So shaming can actually put you over the edge.
And Tom, this is, if you look at it, it's probably just as evident in the European justice system, but especially so in the USA.
Yes.
The USA is 5% of the world's population. They have 25% of the world's prison population.
Yeah.
This is driven primarily, or at least some influence on private enterprise coming into the prison system in the United States during Bill Clinton's reign as president, that it was 3 strikes that you were out.
Yeah.
If an individual got labeled as a criminal, that individual on every job application thereafter, even though they've served their time, they are asked, have they ever been prosecuted or have they ever committed an offense? So that shame, so it's not working, Tom. It's a crazy system because there's no way that people are getting a chance to redeem themselves.
No.
And that's, yeah, what you were saying is fascinating.
And like Patrick, one of the things that, and that's getting into like, we have went from physical there to emotionality, and we're getting into a piece of spirituality now, in the sense that in this, and it shows you how you move through them, because it's fascinating when you're talking about breathing. One of the greatest metaphors that I know is that the very breath that I take in to give me life, I have to let go of it in order to survive. So breathing is a wonderful metaphor for forgiveness. You know, so it's, to me, that's fascinating. You know, and you'll see in all the books and all the of every religion, there's a reference to the breath and the spirit, and they're totally interconnected. And it's fascinating. Like, if I said to you, who inspires you, Patrick? And you know, you could tell me a whole range of people that inspires you. But to inspire means to breathe in.
Totally. And inspire obviously is related to in spirit.
In
And the other
spirit.
thing, Tom, you were talking about the soother. Well, if you go into a pub and you look up at the top shelf, you'll see plenty of spirits.
You will, spirits.
But the only thing is they get you out of your head, but probably, okay, it's fine doing it every now and again. I know you don't drink, but I do.
Yeah.
But there's, coming back to my point now in terms of that, I remember talking to you years and years ago, and you talked about the word forgiveness. Even breaking down that word is interesting.
Yes. So it's forgiving. It's forgiving away.
So what do we give away? The pain that we have inside of us.
You see, if you hold a grudge against someone, it's you holding the pain. Now, we tend to equate forgiveness with religion. And it is, of course, equated with religion, and it's part of lots of religions. But for survival, it's essential. And forgiveness is nothing to do with condoning, because we tend to think that I'm letting someone off with this, that as if in some way we condone it. But it has nothing to do with condoning at all. It's letting me off of the pain that I'm holding.
So that it's not eating you up inside.
And it means that it shouldn't have happened. I acknowledge it shouldn't have happened. Of course it shouldn't have happened. It's not correct that it did happen. So I'm not forgetting it. I'm not anything like that. But I'm disallowing it to have a detrimental effect on me. Now, if somebody does something on you, you're not going to think too much of them. You know, and I remember there was the story that I tell. There was is about Eucharistic ministers. If anybody knows what Eucharistic ministers are,
They give the bread, is it?
They give out the host.
The host.
But I don't know how long they're going. But it's quite a long time ago. They were only starting in my chapel, and the whole talk, you know, the talk in the bookies at the time was, were you asked? And I says, asked what? Were you asked to be a Eucharistic minister? And I says, I'm too young. It's for old boys like you. So, and I says, were you asked? And he'd say, no, I wasn't. And I said, well, why weren't you asked? You know, and he says, there was worse than me asked. You know? So then the next guy would come in and I'd say to him, were you asked? Asked what? Were you asked to be a Eucharistic minister? He says, indeed I was, and I wish I hadn't have been. And I says, so you weren't asking, you're not pleased. And he was asked and he was pleased. So how did the, you know?
Yeah.
I was just keeping it going, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, I says, the whole thing was sorted out in 3 weeks' time when we see how it goes. Now, this is 40 years ago or more. So anyway, 12:30 Mass, went to 12:30 Mass, and they bring up the gifts, and I just happened to see these guys going past, and he says, the only thing coming through my head was if them pair of so-and-sos paid me, I wouldn't have a mortgage. So I was devastated. My world, see, that was a trauma to me, because the whole church, the whole thing it evaporated because of this. And how did they let these so-and-sos do what they're doing, you know, against me? So he showed you how traumatized I was when I was taking all of this personally, you know. So
Yeah.
the
And
next thing,
it was completely outside of your control as well.
completely.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
completely. So
So
I told
you the fact, and I suppose it's a human nature anyway. You're seeing somebody getting rewarded, but you're saying those son of a bitch that they screwed me.
yeah,
Why should they be getting rewarded? So
why should they be getting rewarded?
we develop pain in ourselves as a result of that.
And I was devastated. So I told my poor mother at the time, I said, that's me finished. I'm not going back. You know, so she says, but sure, there's nothing to do with the priest. It has nothing to do with the thing. But I couldn't see it. So anyway, we negotiated, and a couple of months later, I went back and she says, we'll go to 9:30 Mass. So I went to 9:30. And if there wasn't two other guys that owed me money bringing up the gifts, that was it over. And he says, that's it over. But I could have been looking for an excuse not to go anyway.
Yeah.
But I was really, really disgusted. And
Yeah.
one of the guys, this guy came into the bookies one day, and he was a teacher, a head teacher. And I often said to him, you know, you and I is probably friends because you never taught me, because my relationship with teachers was never good.
Yeah.
And I says, but he was a total and absolute gent, and I've known him all my life. And he actually passed away recently, and it's a really nice man. So he says to me, Tom, tell me this. What do you think of the Eucharistic ministers? Come in till I tell you what I think of them. So I packed him down, and I says, so I told him the story. He says, Jeepers, Tom, that's awful. That's really bad. And he says, how did you feel? How do you feel when you think about them? And I says, I don't feel too good. Well, what do you think of these guys now? Well, I don't think an awful lot of them, you know. Do you like the feeling that you feel? No, I do not. And he says, what are you at? You know, what are you getting at? Well, he says, what I'm hearing is, you don't particularly like the people that, you don't particularly like these people, but you're letting these people dictate how you feel, and you don't like the feeling. And I started to get angry at him, and I said, but sure, what else can I do? And he says, let it go. What? Let them off with it. So he taught me a wee mantra, and he taught me this wee mantra, and the mantra was really useful. I use it all the time, and it says, he says, could you send them? I says, what am I going to do? And he says, well, every time you think of them, say this. Could you send them a message in your head? And I says, well, I could send them a message in my head, all right, but they mightn't just like the message I would send them. So he says, when you're praying, he says, I'm sure you've prayed in your life. What direction does your prayers go? And I had never thought of that. But when you think of it, it usually goes up. Like you never seem to pray down there, you know. And then he says, well, when you're thinking of someone, what direction are your thoughts going? So they're usually in a straight line. You know, when you think of somebody, you think of it just in a straight line. The thought goes in a straight line. So he says, when you do that, why don't you send them a wee message and say this? I am sending you love, understanding, forgiveness, health, wealth, happiness, and peace. And I forgive myself for harboring any negative thoughts or feelings around this situation for so long. And he says, is your head right? Is your head right? But he convinced me to do it, and I started to do it.
And how did you feel when you did it? Because if there's an undercurrent of emotion there, it's not going to go away suddenly just by saying positive words.
But he said to me, if it happens, if you think of them 50 times today, he says, do it 51. And he says, with practice, you'll believe it. And I happened to go to a wake, and at the time, wakes in my neck of the woods, you know, they were on all night. You know, you would stay at the whole night, or you stayed for several hours. And it was always you know, after you paid your respects to the family and stuff like that, there was a bit of crack in the room.
Crack, by the way, for our American listeners, means happiness in Irish.
There was a bit of happiness in the thing, and we were talking about stories that maybe the deceased was involved in or whatever. And I had my mate with me, and I just remember I call him. It's amazing, Patrick, because he was my card player. I had a card player. I had a guy that played cards for me.
Wow.
So there you are. So I realized early on that it was no good at playing cards at a particular level, so he did it for me. So him and I went, and we went to the wake. And he says to me when we got out of the wake, he says, "What, did you see them pair of so-and-sos there?" And I says, "I did." But the only feeling I had was, those guys are physically unwell. The whole lot of stuff had left me.
Yeah.
And I remember your man said to me, along with that, he says, "I'm just feeling bad about that whole scenario. Get you paid?" And I says, "No."
Yeah.
So, but
Tom, what was that mantra again? Can you just go through it again?
I am sending you love, understanding, forgiveness, health, wealth, happiness, and peace. And I forgive myself for harboring any negative thoughts or feelings around this situation for so long. So you're sending them all the things that you would like. So you're actually creating now, I didn't believe it for ages, but I kept saying it because I had no other thing, I had no other soother.
Yeah.
I had no other soother. And basically it was get drunk or say this. So I started to say that, and I was totally amazed. Totally amazed.
Do you think that could apply to the most horrific? I'm only thinking of maybe somebody who's getting constantly bet up in a domestic violence situation, or
we have to, you see, in trauma, we have to find a safe place. And basically we must find a safe place. The safe place can be in our head, it can be in our room, it can be somewhere, it can be in the church, it can be wherever you find your own safe place. But we must establish a place of safety. And that's the first thing that we have to do. And then we can start to look at the soothers. And if we make, physical soothers, grounding will soothe you. That's walking in the grass and it will soothe you, and it's got so many benefits that it's so easily done, and it's free. So it will soothe you. And praying will soothe us. For some people, it will soothe us. And if we look at the range of things that stimulate the vagus nerve, those are all soothers.
Yeah.
Because they kick in the parasympathetic response, and that soothes us.
Yeah. And it's amazing just even coming to that, in terms of breathing and stimulating the vagus nerve, and it's the exhalation that activates the parasympathetic response, or at least it's driven by the parasympathetic response tied in with the vagus nerve. But when researchers looked at the number of breaths that were taken during a Tibetan mantra, and they compared it to the number of breaths during the rosary, which is a prayer said in Catholicism, the breaths came down to 5.56 breaths per minute.
Yes.
Now, in the last 20 years, it's been known that this cadence of 5.5 and 6 breaths per minute is the optimal cadence for stimulating the vagus nerve, for improving what's called the sensitivity of the baroreceptors, to improve heart rate variability, but in short, to help restore bodily systems disturbed by stress. Yes. Now, I think this is fascinating because I don't have an interest in institutionalized religion.
Yes.
That's just me. I think that the current, it's almost that religion has been structured like one big company with a CEO at the top. And I think that the message has got lost in the institution. But I do believe that all of the world's religions had something tremendous at their core. Yes. And that tremendousness was forgiveness, but also instilling the mind and having people to relate to life, that they weren't stuck in their heads all of the time. And this is what prayer does. This is what breathing does. Yes. This is what grounding does. Just as you got the serial offender to walk on the snow, and then you put him into a massage chair to get him out of his body. Like, we're frail human beings, really. And we all, like, the breath for me has been my essence. But if you think about the generations now, the church has not really, it's not thriving in Ireland because of the history. And what do 20-year-olds now, what void do they have? Because they're not into breathing per se. Some, of course, are. And maybe their void now, their kind of comfort is Instagram, social media, which is not going to, all it's doing is getting people out of their head, but getting them zoned into, it's almost that they are immersed in the technology that they will never deal with anything, that they are escaping by watching a screen, but it's never getting to the root of what they are escaping from. I'd like your comments on that. Just, what if for a 20-year-old, the void that's missing and the possible issues that may arise as a result of that?
Bring us back to nature. So if we can bring back to nature, we can always identify something that's greater than us. Like AA uses a higher power. But if we think of nature, well, it's definitely bigger than me. Yeah. So if I can nurture a sense of awe, if I can look at a sunset and say, gosh, wow, and you can nurture, or you can stop to smell the roses, where we take the time and get back into nature. There's a wonderful metaphor or description of forgiveness by Mark Twain. And Mark Twain says, and your American audiences will know Mark Twain. Mark Twain says that forgiveness is the fragrance shed by the violet on the heel that crushed it. Forgiveness is the fragrance shed by the violet on the heel that crushed it. So it's pretty profound. So it
That's
shows
amazing, really.
So, and it's beautiful when you see that, and you realize that your spirit is greater than anything else. And we're like, to me, we're a spirit, and we've got a body within that spirit. It's not, the spirit within the body. And if I feel abandoned by the spirit, I have only to check if I'm breathing. Because when I know that I'm breathing, I know the spirit's there, because the spirit leaves when I'm dead.
Yeah.
So does the breath.
Yeah. And Tom, when you were working with these really toughened individuals, and paramilitaries would have been tough, absolutely tough individuals, I know you said that you wouldn't approach it with them from a spiritual point of view because they're not really interested in it. So could you kind of give me an idea of, say, for instance, I'm talking about an alpha male or somebody in law enforcement or first responders. They are dealing with a lot of stress. And even if we just look at the history of what's happened in the last month or so, people make mistakes when they are in stress. And people who are subject to trauma over a period of time become programmed. So they carry out actions based on their programming. What kind of path would you, in general, I know, of course, you would, when you're working with individuals, you're giving them a very specific routine to that individual. But just a few aspects of it. Again, you'd start off with physical. You'd start getting them walking in nature.
Yes, we're starting to get, and then we would look at, always remember that these guys were dying for causes.
Yeah.
So they had something greater than themselves.
Yeah. They had a sense of purpose.
They had a sense of purpose. And they had a very disciplined sense of purpose that required doing things that was totally against their values as well, in many cases. So they have, to say that they have a real sense of purpose. And that's what made them so devastating. That's why the things lasted so long, because it wasn't overnight.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the emotions and we can tie it all into their sense of values, to their sense of purpose, to their sense of cause or whatever.
Yeah.
So they do believe.
Yeah.
And they believe to the death. And that's quite a
and
belief.
Can that belief be undone?
Well, I mean, it's certainly been readjusted. Our belief systems are readjusted all the time. Like for example, I'll give you an example, Patrick. If you were going somewhere with your family and it was a beautiful day, and in Ireland it can rain even on beautiful days.
For sure.
You have an umbrella with you. But you're at this fair, and there's a big poster in front of you. It's about 20 meters or 20 yards away from you. And your family's with you. We're having a bit of fun, enjoying the crack. And the next thing, you hear these obscenities being shouted at you from, you know it's coming from behind the poster. You know it's a male voice. And you're devastated. And everybody around you is sort of embarrassed for you. And they're saying, what's going on there? And you say, I don't know. But you have support. So you're deciding you're going to find out.
Mm-hmm.
And the closer you get, the worse it gets and the more personal it becomes. And you're really, really disturbed with it. So you then look around and you see that this person who's given out has Down syndrome. You see, what happens?
Yeah.
The only thing that has changed in that is the meaning you put to the situation, because the words then became meaningless.
Yeah.
So we have that facility. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Do.
So we have that facility to change how we. So I look like everybody. The Christians will say, look for the Christ in the person, and you'll say, well, me, you're going to have to be looking for a while. But it's amazing how when we change, I remember my daughter used she used to ring me up and she'd say to me, Daddy, every time I ring up, I seem to be giving out about work. And I says, you're not. I says, you're debriefing. But that simple word changed her whole thing, that she was dumping stuff on me. You know, it's changed everything. And she says, Daddy, I've got to debrief. And she'd rant on and vent. And I say, thanks, Daddy. But it meant that she had a facility to be able to do that. So if we have got somebody that's doing that to us, instead of taking it on board, they're not looking fixed. They're not looking advice. They're not looking anything which we would probably want to fix.
Yeah.
They just want to vent. So give them facility to do that and let it go out of your head as well.
Yeah. And I'm thinking the female can do it better than the male. Is this maybe why the male would have a tendency to go down to the pub after a couple of pints when they're kind of a little bit more mellow, that they can talk these things?
Plus, he's not stupid. The male will also, if the anger's in him, he won't take it out in the pub until he gets home.
Yeah.
Because it's safer, you know. So we've got this, you know, we're not stupid beings either in that sense. But it's fascinating. So if we change how we look at things, the things we look at change. So when we change, like if you heard, you know, turn the other cheek, you know, turn the other cheek, what does it mean to you? So if I turn this cheek here to you, and you're looking at this cheek, and then I turn, and I'm looking at something there, and I turn this cheek here, well, I'm looking at something completely different.
Yeah.
So it means change perspective. You know, change your perspective, change how you look at it. And somebody that's messing me about, and somebody like I could use sometimes to get out of a situation, I could use something like, well, they could be calling me names, they could be doing this, they could be insulting me. And I believe that the only reason why those would hurt me is because at some level I believe they're true. Because if I said something, Paul McKenna used to talk about, if I said to you, you're a green-skinned Martian, sure, you couldn't identify with it, so you just think I was a nut.
Yes. You
know, so it's all to do with how we talk to ourselves, the rituals that we use to soothe, because they're all rituals, and rituals are we're well programmed to suit rituals. When I was in the bookies, I started work about 10:30 and had great difficulty getting up for it. Now I can, you know, now I'm hitting the shower at 5:30.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You know,
Yeah.
it's just amazing. It's just total transformation.
Yeah.
And the breath was one of the greatest discoveries for me. And that's why your work is so precious, Patrick. It's precious. It's so precious. And it's at every level, you know.
But isn't there a great interconnectedness, Tom? Like in terms of psychotherapy, in terms of mental health, in terms of breathing, and in
Yeah.
terms of sleep. But how come very few people have looked at mental health from a multi-dimensional perspective that you have looked at it? And I will give you an example. I gave a talk to a large group of people involved in mental health. And I talked about cognitive behavioral therapy is brilliant. It really is excellent. But it's not addressing respiratory physiology. And that's been shown in studies that if you have an individual who is in that fight or flight, fast breathing, mouth breathing, shallow breathing, they are going to be physiologically in a state of fight or flight.
Yes.
So why not deal with that? And also, if they're waking up tired, why not help to deal with that? Because whether it's a child, a teenager, or an adult, if the child or teenager or adult is in a state of exhaustion, you don't have clarity of the mind. And I have to say, the way you have weaved everything in together, it's tremendous, because somebody coming in through your door, you can give them a multifaceted approach tailored to the individual. But that's brilliant. We as human beings have been stuck too long in our silos. And I think it's time for the mental health professionals to start realizing that you cannot just have one approach. And this is not a knock, but this is just my own experience, because I've met resistance from individuals because in that field, but I'm saying to them, how can you help somebody with depression? How can you help them with anxiety? How can you help them with high stress levels? Just by approaching it from a counseling point of view, that we have to open the door and look at breathing. For me, breathing was one of the best things, because I have a constant companion that's always there, that I can bring my attention onto the breath, to connect with the breath, to get out of my head, to bring me into the present moment. And it's all tied in with what we have spoken about.
You've made me think of something else, Patrick, that was fascinated me by Richard Bandler, the NLP guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going over there looking for answers, you know, but for me, because there was so many things going on in my head that, you know, is there something really wrong with me? And he kept saying things like, if something's not working, do something else. You know, and I says, well, that makes sense to me. If something's not working, do something else. And he was big into changing states and hypnosis and stuff like that. But so there was a large crowd there, maybe 450 people. And everyone got a chance to ask questions. Now, there's lots of people just didn't want to ask questions, but I put my hand up and I says, Richard, that's fine. You know, you keep saying every day. We were there for maybe 11 or 12 days. I just can't remember, but we were there for maybe 11 or 12 days. And it was from early morning till late at night. So it was complete, you know, you were definitely immersed in it. Yeah. So we were immersed in it and immersed in it. So I said to him, okay, if you don't, you know, you keep saying that if something's not working, do something else. I says, if you don't know what else to do, what do you do? He says, start with the opposite to what you're doing. And I says, well, that makes sense as well. So I says, like, the opposite to drinking is not drinking. You see? And I says, but I feel miserable if I don't drink sometimes. Yeah. So, and he says, check what you're doing at the time and do the opposite. And then I got embarrassed then asking him too many questions because there's loads of people looking to ask. And so I say, I'll ask him the next day, but then it was on a completely different topic. So I come home about 3 weeks later, or in about 3 weeks, I came home and I was going to fix the whole world because I was in a big high. And about 3 weeks after that, I was sitting and I took a notion to go for a drink. And wild horses wouldn't have stopped me, you know. And so he says, where are you, Bandler, when I need you? You know? And they started to say, like, you know, we're the opposite to drinking is not drinking, but I'm miserable. And he says, then it says, check what you're doing at the time. And I says, what's that all about? So I started to think, what am I doing? And I was imagining up at the top right-hand corner, I noticed that I was imagining a video. And these guys were coaxing me, come on, Tom, what harm are you doing? Like, I mean, you're working all week and, you know, you're doing nobody any harm. Just a bit of crack. Let your hair down. I had hair at that time. And they were faceless people, but I tended to know them, and I seemed to know the location and everything, and it was driving me astray. So I says, right, that's the top right. And I had learned a thing called EMDR, which is, I'll go into, do you ever hear of EMDR?
No.
Eye movement EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Psychiatry uses it. So I says, right, so in trauma you move the eyes, not the head. Because if you move the eyes, you get a different result. So I was focusing on top right, and this is these guys doing my head in on this video, telling me to come on. So I moved the eyes to bottom left. And I created a video for me of me on my knees throwing up into the loo. And the notion of drink left me immediately. And every single time that I felt a notion of drink, I just went to bottom left. Every single time. I never drank since.
Wow. Wow. Tom, this has been an absolutely fascinating talk. We always kind of cut them at about 60 minutes. And yeah. I know that we could continue on, but there are some tremendous nuggets there. And there are nuggets there for everybody. So if people wanted to reach out to you, how can they reach out to you?
Well, I have two websites. One of them is tomherronexperience.com.
How do you spell Herron?
HERRON. And there's also PEPSfitselfcare.com. PEPSfitselfcare.com.
And if you go to the bottom of the YouTube channel, we will have all of Tom's information there. So when you see the video, just scroll down. For any of the listeners who want to make contact with Tom, his email address will be there. His website's address will be there as well.
So it's been fascinating, Patrick. And as I say, you were definitely one of the major changes in my whole approach, because I brought breathing into it at all levels. And I bring breathing in for athletes, as you know, I bring it into, because they all need the help, and it's fascinating. So you see the connection between the physical, the emotional, the psychological, and the spiritual, because getting out of your heads, everything.
Yeah. Tom, tremendous. It's been a great journey together. Thanks so much.